What liberalism does, it actually makes climate change an issue of technology, of numbers, of measurement. That disenfranchises ordinary people from the debate.
I wanted to start, for the benefit of our listeners, with a pretty simple question, which is what actually is liberalism? I think it gets tossed around a lot and maybe we use it quite loosely. So how do you define liberalism?
Yeah, he says a simple question.
Yeah.
That's right. There's many books being written in an effort to define what liberalism is. And for the purposes of this book, I sort of try to personify it, really, and think about it in terms of the bourgeoisie and that type of liberalism. And so why the bourgeoisie? Well, that's a form of liberalism that seeks to pursue order, stability, regularity, but only in so much as that regularity, that order, that stability allows one to predict the future such that it becomes more amenable to stable profit making. And for that reason, it feels to me a more interesting perspective than, say, going head-on with capitalism. And the reason for that, I think, in that role of stability and order and regularity that bourgeoisie seek, culture becomes a very important aspect, an important tool in that. So how does the horrors and the costs and the impacts of capitalism, how are those made amenable, acceptable, and seen as kind of the limit for what we could possibly hope to imagine. And so the bourgeoisie are very central to that cultural aspect as well. Because we all know it wouldn't be news to say, oh yeah, capitalists, the greedy people who are robbing us all and destroying the planet. And we all know that, and indeed liberal bourgeoisie culture provides plenty of films and books that tell us this, right? But still we turn up every day and we reproduce that system. And perhaps, money means that we don't have much choice and the need to keep a roof over our head. But that for me is the form of liberalism that I'm interested in. Now, beyond that personification, there is a whole kind of ideological structure of what liberalism is. Its desire to, I think one of the most interesting things that climate change poses a challenge to liberalism on is the desire to separate issues. So an issue of, say, poverty or child poverty in a liberal system is treated as a problem, not of the system, but somehow the part that's meant to deal with providing material provisions for children is going wrong. So that's what we look at. So liberalism, I think, is being forced to confront some of those tensions that historically it's masked and hidden. Climate change is forcing it to confront those. It's almost, I talk about in the book, it's almost like a receding glacier reveals the secrets of the lost mountaineers or the wrecks, as it falls back. So climate change is called forcing liberalism to recede from some of these, or at least begging that it looks at some of these assumptions. So another one of these key distinctions that authors note around liberalism is the distinction between the private and the public. So okay, whatever I do in private, I am free to pursue. As long as I've got the money, I can pursue whatever I want to, in private, and that the government shouldn't interfere in that. But actually, my private actions now, because they have a carbon output associated with them, are public. That division is starting to get pulled back as well. So, for me, the bourgeoisie really kind of represent that bulwark against those changes. And I think there's also, it's a little bit more than that. It's in the book, Graham Greene's quite American, and there's the main character, and whose name escapes me now. I think it's somebody Pyle, P-Y-L-E. Anyway, he's an American, he's in Vietnam, and he is supporting, he's there for the CIA, he's there and he's supporting the people who are working against the communists in Vietnam. So he's enabling sort of bombing campaigns, terror campaigns, and there's a certain kind of zeal, a certain kind of enthusiasm that this character has for those actions. It doesn't matter if some people get killed. The most important thing, what the people of Vietnam will thank the CIA, the America, the West for, is having brought democracy there. So there's this certain also evangelicism about the cause, a certain fanaticism, I think, within liberalism. And again, and I can't remember who it said it, but they described liberalism as a fighting creed. So it's not just liberalism. It offers a promise of tolerance and we all get along, again, as long as you know what you do in private. But actually, it cannot coexist with our systems, and there's so much in our history of how liberalism, under that kind of Western hegemony, has sought to actually make the whole world in its own sort of image, as it were. So those are the kinds of elements of liberalism that I think are really are being brought under pressure by climate change. And I think they are part of the worldview that has underpinned how liberalism has sought to represent climate change in a way that ultimately climate change is not a threat to liberalism. And that's the primary purpose of how liberalism has constructed the threat of climate change and how it continues to do that.
So how would a true liberal, I guess, describe or understand the climate crisis? And in particular, I'm thinking about both, why it has come about and also what we should do about it. Because I imagine it's quite distinct to how, a Marxist or someone else might think about the climate crisis as a challenge.
So liberalism, the idea that there's a knowable single dangerous limit for climate change. So that has been established. It was for a long time described as 2 degrees of warming. So there's a period of time prior to the industrial age, and that's seen as the benchmark. And that is, and so what emerged in the sort of late 20th century as climate change became increasingly apparent as an issue that needed responding to was a articulation of climate change as a phenomenon that has a limit. There's a dangerous limit. As long as we don't go beyond that limit, then everything is okay. So they're safe, everything is great. Beyond that limit, it's dangerous. So there's this very much this dichotomous safe, not safe amount of climate change. This emerged from sort of UN, United Nations related institutes, and others in the as I say, sort of the late second half of the 20th century. And they emerged out of military infrastructures. For example, the Met Office is a military organisation ultimately. It became about how do we how can we control the world? How can we understand, map and control the world? These are the global institutions from the global north, spreading that formulation across the world. So there's one single dangerous limit for climate change. So that's one way in which, despite the promise of respect for diversity and the individual experience, actually that is all swept aside in the face of this phenomenon, and it becomes a single dangerous limit for the world. So what liberalism does, it creates this idea of a single global dangerous limit, right? So you can measure that. The global north can, because it's got the mechanisms and the infrastructure to monitor and measure these things. And so it can monitor and measure these items. But what liberalism does, and I think this is really key, this is the core of the problem, and also why it becomes a class issue. So it actually makes climate change an issue of technology, of numbers, of measurement. And so whatever market mechanisms, whatever technologies, whatever individual behavior change is needed, as long as we don't breach this number, then everything is absolutely, is fine, and we haven't gone into dangerous climate change. But actually, where the division emerges between that construction, that elite sort of liberal construction, and I'm sorry to frame it like that, because I know that you start to get into kind of some of the conspiracy theory, elite liberalism. They are elite actors, and they are serving a liberal ideology. And but by making an issue of number, technology, mechanics, and budgets, that disenfranchises sort of the ordinary people from the debate. But when and I've done this a lot, I've run a number of workshops with the public across the world. I've spoken to a lot of what I would say, lay audiences, non-expert, non-scientific audiences about climate change. And for them, it's actually a moral and political kind of issue. So it's grounded in sense of what's right and what's wrong, what needs protecting, what elements of our life and our culture need protecting. So it's very much, it's bound up with the sense of, is this fair? Was what's happening fair? I'm worried about the impact on wildlife. I'm worried about the impact on nature. I'm worried about the impact on my children. And there's this very value-laden, moralistic grounding, which that 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees dangerous limit absolutely alleviates, and that's what it's always been designed to do. It's been designed to try and remove the politics from climate change and make it a purely technocratic issue. And actually, where that leaves us today is that certainly in climate change, there's only sort of one political stance. There's only one politics, and that's a right-wing politics. That's a viewpoint that tries to make climate change political. And outside of that, there is no politics really in the mainstream. It's just either it's a right-wing attack on the politics of climate change, or it's an effort to pretend climate change is not political. It's just about technology, science, measurement, nudging people's behaviour here, nudging people's behaviour there, burying some of the carbon, think about it in terms of budgets. So that's the real difference. That's what liberalism, that's the understanding of climate change that liberalism is constructed. And then why that's really a problem and why now is the time to really address that framing that we've taken for granted for 50 years. That is a problem because we are now, it's broadly recognised that we move beyond the idea or the chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees has gone. So that we're not left with any other way to think about this if we stay within that liberal technocratic framing, other than to say, oh, well, the targets never mattered anyway. So what happens now, and you'll see this commentary, is that, oh, well, they don't get harm on the targets. We'll do everything we were required and we'll continue thinking about it in the way that the targets required of us. But we won't worry about the fact that the targets are gone. We still carry on doing all those things. So now, so that has failed. There's a sense in which some elections are giving birth to right-wing politics in Europe and the US, and where climate policy of any form has been rejected. I think it's certainly in Holland. I think they said that the Netherlands, they're planning to throw out everything, and so it's failed, right? It had failed. It's always going to fail. That failure is now apparent, and so to face up to that failure is to step outside of that liberal frame, to have the bravery, the vision to do that and move into a value-laden and a moralistic approach to climate change rather than this technocratic liberal one.
We've talked a lot about liberalism, its ideas, how it kind of thinks of things almost in the abstract, as if it's some kind of being in and of itself. So I'd love to just bring it back down to, I guess, a more concrete level and ask, who in your analysis, in your story of liberalism and its response to climate change, who are the agents? What explains how liberalism came to be the kind of dominant way that we organize our societies, and how do you explain its endurance in the current context?
In the book, I talk about how, and I think it was Engels who described this, that in Manchester you had, all of a sudden you've got the capitalists, the owners of capital, and the working class cheek by jowl, and that difference in life circumstances, in income, was just too great. It was a threat to the social order. So you need a class to sit between the two of them, and what that class does is it offers a hope. Talking about progress. Okay, so but you might be able to become middle class. And that's the great. You're not going to become ruling class, of course not. But you could become middle class. So it serves that function. So there's, as well as it emerging, and this is beyond my understanding of Marxism, but I'm sure Marxists would identify coherent ways in which, the shift from feudalism to capitalism generated this class of the bourgeoisie. But nonetheless, they serve a very useful social function as this buffer between the ruling class, and they offer hope and aspiration of a better life that's available to the working class. And that then also gets replicated and produced in the culture. So culture is a really key part of this. And you can see things like the way like Disney, the formation of Disney has been described as we've got a massive inflow of immigrants into America that need to be, you can't have all their cultures and all their barbaric ways just left to run right. So you need to school people in what is the appropriate way to be an American. So Disney emerges and things like this. Culture is a form of ideology, it's a form of control. That's what it's there to do. And if you look at any films or programs, The Day After Tomorrow was a climate change film, and all of a sudden there was this massive freezing event, and the world was, almost at civilization was almost at its end, and liberalism in the form of white Americans came to the rescue. And what do rescue mean? I think towards the end, as I recall of the film, is like the president re-emerges and he offers a promise of the return to the order that there was before. So that's all that ever happens in our culture, right? There is, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and the synthesis is always the return back to this liberal order. There's no culture, that goes on to say how, like a communist future was built and how everyone was happy. And then you have and it's always built around the role of the individual. So many films, so many stories are the individual breaking from the crowd and they have become the heroine or the hero of the story. And it's that individual realization as an individual, separate from the kind of strangulation of the crowd, of the mass, that is extolled as the virtue that we should all be aiming for. So we're all looking for that importance, that notoriety, which individualism and liberalism gives us. So I think liberalism offers that illusion of the individual as important and as separate from the crowd, and that as the ideal, to be that important person. And then also another way that liberalism has become entrenched is through mass slaughter. So we again, the Vietnam, so we can go all through like any effort to build a communist alternative, and you could go from the Russia and the Western involvement in the Civil War there, in the Soviet Union, all the way through. So any effort to build an alternative to this, of stories that are kind of a challenge to liberalism, if they can't be dealt with ideologically or culturally, are dealt with through violence. And in the UK, about 20 years ago, Greenpeace were infiltrated by the police, who were adopting the names of dead children, and they were getting the activists pregnant, the female activists pregnant. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's nothing the state will not do to protect itself, any state, I guess, whether it's communist or whatever, but the liberal state as well, for all this niceness, and it will seek to prevent any meaningful challenge to it through language, through culture firstly, but then it will resort to law and violence if it needs to. But there'll be no limit to what it would do if it felt that its integrity and its legitimacy was threatened. And this is what liberalism is doing now. It's driving us through to the very brink of some unimaginable, unprecedented catastrophe, rather than look at itself and re-examine itself and ask, well, what alternatives are there to this pursuit of individual liberty, given what we face?
And I think one of the things that's so interesting is liberalism tries to present itself very strongly in the language of freedom. And so, part of the reason that it likes to think of climate crisis as a sort of more technocratic issue is, we don't need to infringe on, freedoms that people currently have, which broadly is limited to the freedom to, consume and engage in the market. But do you think that's true? I mean, liberalism, it's in the name, freedom, liberalism. Do you think that's actually what it has on offer, or is it something very different to that?
Those policies preserve our freedom So that's why they're so important. Yeah, yeah. I mean, when I hear the word freedom, red flags for me. I think, okay, well, someone's trying something on here. Because as much as I struggle to define liberalism, I'd imagine people would struggle to define freedom. Outside, I can choose what type of shirt I'm going to wear today, and etc. And I can choose how I'm going to go somewhere if I've got the money. But other than that, I think it's a bit of a misnomer. And in writing the book, I come from a working class background, and I really welcome the opportunity to sort of abandon my culture and be free. And that was part of the counterculture, as an individual, the system's squashing my individualism and my expression of who I truly am, my authentic self, etc., etc. And for me, I went off to university in 1990, and that time, I think it was John Major. Up to that point, the universities, there was no grant, you didn't have to pay to study. And you get unemployment benefit during the holidays and stuff. It's a nice stuff. But then they opened it up. So when I came, that had all gone. You didn't pay for your tuition. But I was like this first tranche of kind of, like working class ne'er-do-wells who want, this is a great opportunity to do something different, and going off. And so I love liberalism for that chance to kind of break free of what was, really narrow-minded background for me. No one in my immediate family had gone to university before. So I loved it. I was meeting new people, doing new things. So I was very, for that reason, I really liked liberalism, the freedom it gave me. I think, and I'll come back to the freedom point in a moment. The point I'm making in the book is it's become sclerotic now, liberalism. Whereas I thought, okay, so this is a means, an ideology, or an approach to organising societies that opens up the political imagination. Let's let 1,000 flowers bloom, and we're all individuals bringing our ideas to the table. But of course, that isn't quite what happened. And as I read the book, I became more and more taken with the writings from Marxists about the limits to individualism. And in fact, actually freedom, the idea that freedom resides with the individual, especially for a subaltern or working class individual, is an absolute lie, that freedom actually comes through the collective, because in this society, freedom for the wolves is slaughter for the lambs, right? So it's great. I think it's a con that means those who are really rich, so don't tell me what to do. No one's telling you what to do. They can't tell me what to do. But of course, the rich man is as free to sleep under the bridges of Paris as the tramp, or whatever the saying is. So I think for me, freedom is not a helpful or authentic goal, or at least not the way that it's been constructed under liberalism as the freedom in the marketplace. I think it's about something that only comes through the collective, because otherwise, as I say, we're just prey to those with more power than us. And
how does your working class background that you mentioned there, how does that inform the way that you think about the climate crisis?
So I think I do carry some of that kind of outsider perspective. So I think it was about 80. The reason I went to university was around about 89. Climate change was just coming onto the agenda. A guy called James Hansen, very famous scientist, still very much cited, a very important figure. In 1988, he stood up in the Senate in the US, I think it was, and said climate change is here, or global warming is here. I think global warming was the term at the time. So for me, I thought, great, I really latched onto that for two reasons. A, I thought this is like, to steal from Bob Marley, this is the small axe that chops down the big tree. I just thought, right, intuitively it felt correct. So I was a rebel looking for a cause. Okay, so climate change came along, I thought, brilliant, because there's no way, right, because I could just see it, yeah, of course. And so there's no way we're going to carry on with capitalism. Obviously, everyone will see that we can't carry on like this. The science seems sound. It just struck me, yeah, right, this is the one. This is definitely the big news. And it was me and about three other people in the world at the time. It was a very fringe concern. And I'd grown up in the 80s, Margaret Thatcher came into power in 79, I think. And so up to that point, and so her vision of the world, I think, she may have been quoting from someone else, saying if a man at the age of 26 finds himself on a bus, then he should consider himself a failure. And I thought, well, I could barely afford the bus. So I knew that the world that was coming was not a world for me. I didn't feel at home in that world. And it became such a materialistic world and so focused on a person's worth was on how much money they had. So I've had that constant disappointment in my efforts to sort of find an articulation, a way of thinking and acting on climate change that both speaks to the science, which is obviously robust, speaks to rational and reasoned action, but also grab some of that anger and some of that frustration and some of that energy of the working class, which is so absent from the climate debate at the moment.
And what would a climate politics that, takes class seriously look like for you?
Yeah, so it wouldn't just be climate change as such. So, for example, at the moment, there's one of the things people talk about is green jobs. And I did some work with Tribune a while ago, a couple of years ago, and we did some surveys, thinking about working class and the climate change, and tested what the idea of green jobs meant to them, and it was not of any appeal. And I've seen this in a few different surveys, because what is a working person's job? What does it matter if that job is carbon neutral or not? There's no carbon. If the job's a shit job and the money's shit, and I feel like a lower class citizen for doing the work, and I'm looked down upon by the people who are making decisions that affect my life, and I'm losing control over my life through automation, etc., then those people telling me, oh no, don't worry, there's some good jobs here, green jobs here, isn't going to work. So I really that gives me some hope that there's the rejection of that. So what would it look like? Well, and I think this is what I was just sort of speaking about there, that tension. I spend a fair amount of time with working class people who haven't necessarily had a lot of education, and they're finding very frustrating and annoying at times. But nonetheless, I want to come back to this point about this moralistic approach to climate change, I think, is what the working class climate politics would look like. It wouldn't be obsessed with budgets. It wouldn't be obsessed with targets. It would say, how do we build a better world for everyone? Not how do we reproduce this world just minus the emissions, but how do we actually speak to the concerns of people? And so the working class, when I speak with them, what's one of the primary issues is they don't trust what they're being told, and why would they? I don't trust what I'm being told, and so there's a lack. So how do you start to build a society where there is trust? I tell you what else would go, and I think this would be really taboo, but I think it's really interesting, the thing no one really talks about in climate change. So to come back to my current colleague and friend George Marshall. A while ago, he wrote an article, and he said, look, really, to live within our carbon budgets in the West, it would mean going back to 1973. I think 1973 was the year. And he said, no one really flew on holiday then. You went camping. Well, I certainly did. I lived in Dorset, and our annual holidays were camping in Dorset, and I didn't feel at all deprived. And sort of this much more, the way people shopped for their food and lived was very different. And I thought, well, yeah, that's, that makes sense. That I really like that. But the point is, right, and I think this is really where the working class could really offer something. And I think we're the real tension. The point is, you'd have to go to 1973 and you'd have to stay there. Right. So liberalism at its heart is this idea of progress. And that's the sop to the working class. That's kind of one of its dangly jewels is, I know it's rubbish today, but look, tomorrow could be better. Or look, don't worry, one click and you can buy something with Amazon and you'll feel a little bit better for a while, So there's
And it's delivered by an EV.
Yeah, that's right. So I feel good. That's it. And less plastic in the packaging than there used to be. All good. There's this tension between the stability of social political order, but within the marketplace, you want that constant churn of new technologies, new profit opportunities. Otherwise, it grinds to a halt. So you have this ceaseless churning of the world, this ceaseless desire for progress, and it leaves us. And I think you'd be hard pushed to find people say, I think it's great that 6 and 7-year-olds have their own mobile phones and access to social media now. You might do, but certainly when I talk to when I've spoken to working class groups and workshops about climate change, this disquiet about the technological change comes through. And it's not, and I don't know if there's anything wrong with being Luddite, it's not small-mindedness. And I was stuck with me speaking with a group, I think it was in Birmingham, and they were saying, look, like when we sit down for Sunday dinner, the phones go away when it's family time. It's a real tradition, Sunday dinner. I don't care whether it's roast dinner or whether it's Mexican, whether it's curry, whether it's, pizza. It's the coming together, as we do as a ritual each week. So it's about those, so it's about a climate change policy that brought the working class along, I think, would speak to tradition. I think it would speak to the nation. I think it would speak to stability. One of the very well-known scientists I interviewed for the book was talking about his friends, working class friends. I'd say all they want to do is do their job, go to work, have a few beers at the weekend, have some time with their family. It's not this desire it's not like this ambition, this drive, this dissatisfaction with everything and desire to try and remake the world. So I think a climate change politics that actually broke through that class division would be a very different world. And I think any effort to tinker with it by just saying, well, we'll make green jobs and call them good jobs and label it a just transition isn't going to cut it, isn't going to do it. It just doesn't land with the working class. So it would be a very different world, but the role of technology, the role of progress would be very different in that world.
So we're doing away with freedom. We're doing away with progress. It could be a tough sell. It could be a tough sell.
Yeah.
But what do you think? What would you say to someone who asks, "Okay, you're not giving me freedom, at least in the way I understand it now. You're not giving me progress in the way it's been sold to me. What would you say, could be offered in a world where we actually, address the climate crisis in a way that takes into account the importance of inequality and sort of class divisions? What do you think, you can offer that person?
Yeah, so I think it would be a focus on community. And of course, so community gets bandied around a lot as a term. And in the book, I talk about how, well, actually, like for a community to be a community, it can't be open borders because it's no longer a community. If anyone can come and go, then there's nothing that defines it as a community. So it has to have some kind of entry barrier to it for it to be, whatever that might be, locality or whatever. So I think what one starts to offer, is a more equal world because, again, the literature is pretty clear on this, that inequality generates these social tensions. And if you're not the person at the top of the pile, then, of course, you've got the dissatisfaction of looking what other people have got. So it's a world where actually we come together and we say, well, what is it we want to keep? And I think one of the things that we need to, and again, this is one of the problems with this framing of dangerous and safe climate change. So we need to make a decision about what it is we're going to keep and what it is we're going to have to let go. So again, I take your point, well, that's a difficult sell. And on the alternative, well, you can have it all. And I think it's a really important step here about how this opens up to a broader demographic of people is an understanding of what are the risks we face. So to say, you're going to have to give up your freedoms, you're going to give up the chance to travel, you're going to give up the chance of a better technology tomorrow, progress tomorrow, in order for what? I don't know, it's just all scaremongering, isn't it? There's this tension at the moment in the debate about where catastrophists or doomers, so you're a part of the problem. If we don't solve this problem, I love that word solve, it's such a misnomer in terms of climate change. There is no solution, but we can come to that. You're a doomer, you're a catastrophist, and you'll say it's going to fall apart. And the response to that is, but net zero will save us. You're ignoring the fact that net zero will save us. And so those are the two visions that were basically annihilation for us all, end of humanity, etc., or net zero and everything as it is, and somehow climate change has disappeared. And what the work that's not being done is how, well, it is, but on the margins, people like Salvage, etc., are doing this. Dark Mountain have done it, but it's not really coming into the mainstream. It needs to. Is that space in between those two scenarios? So net zero will 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees is a heavily impacted world. Doesn't mean we're all dead and it's the end of civilization, but it means we do have to find a different way of living. So again, I would say our ability to enjoy these freedoms that we're so used to is already coming under threat. So for the working class in Europe, in the North Europe, but certainly in Britain, fly to France, fly to Spain, Portugal, Greece for your summer holidays. It's already, I would imagine, people thinking, well, do I want to go there in July and August if it's going to be 45 degrees? Already these kinds of what the freedoms, what the payoffs were for the misery of life in capitalism are already becoming under threat, food shortages, etc. So the actual ability to sustain what those freedoms and those ideas of progress and dreams of a better tomorrow are very much being eroded whichever way we do it. So can we get some control over that? Can we begin that conversation, a really decent, sort of honest, open conversation like, okay, what do we keep? We keep the best medical care for as many people as we can. Surely that's got to be number one. And how do we keep people fed? How do we keep people housed? And what is that? And then once we've done that, then we can start thinking, what else can we do? But that's, for me, is nothing in that. In my conversations with the working class would be anathema to what they're after and what matters to them.
And you write in the book as well about the importance of the idea of the local to a kind of working class politics of climate change. And I think as well the problem with how globalized the way that we tend to talk about it is. And the 1.5 or 2 degrees target is a good example of that, right? It's a inherently global target that doesn't tangibly mean anything to anyone really. Like, what does 1.5 degrees look like for me? I have no idea. I know it's scary and dangerous. So what do you see as the importance of the local to climate politics? And do you think there's potentially a risk or a trade-off between sort of focusing on making this a kind of more local issue versus the fact that it is ultimately, a planetary challenge and we need some degree of kind of global solidarity and coordination to, I won't say solve, but to kind of grapple with it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm going to give a personal reflection here while protecting the anonymity of the people involved. It is so in the book, and these are my terms. So, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the author now. I think Schmidt talks about like the somewheres and nowheres. And I think he's citing someone else as well. So this is the idea that the somewheres are the working class. So, and he cites a fact of quite a surprising number of, like, I think it's like 50% of Americans who live within, like 5 miles of where their mother lives or whatever. And then you've got the nowheres, which are people probably like us and people watching this, and are either international, they've gone where the work and where the career and where the opportunities have taken them, and they're happy in a number of different sort of cultural contexts. Now, so the personal reflection is, so I live in this sort of 1 foot in a working class world and 1 foot in a middle class kind of world. So I'm a bit of a nowhere, as I was saying earlier, not internationally, but I moved around within the UK. My wife, she used to live in Dubai with a family, and I met her in Cambridge, and now we live in Sussex. So we've moved around a lot, my family in Dorset. And my sons are in their 20s, and one is his girlfriend. They live in Devon, Somerset, and they basically all live in the same road, right? Like grandmother, mother, sisters, cousins. It's brilliant. It's really lovely. They've got that support there. And then again with my youngest, that family have always lived in Seaford, so I can see. And some of my best friends are sort of the somewheres. I can see what that brings for them in terms of stability and in terms of community. So how do you relate that to the global? I think that there is a challenge there, but I think what the point being is that through the discussion of adaptation, the discussion to prepare and live with whatever impact's coming, well, that is always going to be kind of local, right? The global processes, but the flood or the heat wave or whatever it may be is going to happen in my town or in my home, in my street. So I think that's where the local and the global can start to work together. It's through this lens of adaptation. But again, that comes back to my sort of original point where we've got to break down this these mainstream ideas that 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees is a solution. There's some recent work being done. It's ongoing in academia where you'll work with communities and you'll say, well, what do you want? What's your ideal 2050, or what do you want the world to be like? And people articulate, well, pretty much like today. It's a bit more Extinction Rebellion-y, but mostly it's kind of people do everything they do now. They travel less far to do it. And maybe there's more allotments, etc. And there's a few wind turbines in the background. There's no climate impacts. So the world that people are being asked to work towards at the moment is no longer available to us, right? And that's the science. That's not me sort of being some kind of doom or trying to exaggerate. That world that's of stability, according to the science, is not available to us anymore. So the conditions under which that kind of social formations can be built do not exist anymore. So I think that if we want to start building an ability, I think that's what we need to do, as well as the mitigation. We really do need to get to grips with this adaptation thing, but we do need to democratize it. We do need to ground it in the local. It's a different ball game from the mitigation discourse of trying to limit emissions, because the efforts to, if you say to someone, if you cycle to the shops instead of driving twice a week, at one point you say, well, there's this really awful global problem, but you cycling to the shop twice a week instead of driving is going to solve it. And people say, it hasn't worked really. People keep pummeling away at it, this individual behaviour change. It's irrelevant. It's a misnomer, and it won't make any difference. But on an adaptation score, all of a sudden it does. You start thinking about, well, how do you share food if food becomes short? Access to food becomes short. Or we need to start growing it more locally because those supply chains are under threat because of climatic changes. How do we deal with the flooding in a town? How do we help people when these things? So I think that's really where we start to build with the local, is that through adaptation and preparedness. Our only hope is to tell more honest stories about the future. If we want to build a movement that can break through as I say, this sclerotic sort of stranglehold that liberalism has on our imagination, which is ironic, as I say, given what I thought liberalism was about, a freeing of the human mind, a freeing of the human potential. It seems to be doing it in the face of climate change, restricting our options. If we want to begin that process and we want it to be inclusive and we want it to break through the class barriers, then we do have to find a different form of hopeful story. The only hopeful story really at the moment is climate change has been made to disappear under the cloak of liberalism. That's broadly what it is. It has to be a hopeful story that is aligned with the climate science. It says it's not hopeful with just this and some wind turbines. It is hopeful in a different way, hopeful in a way that we build a world in the ruins. And I think I am stealing from salvage here, so I will recognise that's not original. But that is a hopeful story that brings the working class in and it says, yeah, we're going to order things where you don't carry shame anymore. You're not looked down on. People are talking about like a par economy, like participatory economy, you know, so, you know, where we're all, I don't know, stocking the shelves in the supermarkets 1 week a year or whatever it might be. But, you know, where absolutely you're not carrying that. And again, I think it's Richard Seymour, it's great, and there's a great essay in Salvage where he talks about his own working class experiences, like of you know, just the misery and the shame. I think shame's a real key word here, and respect for other, you know, the respect for the working class. But he talks about, you know, going to a shitty job in shitty clothes for a shitty wage, feeling like I'm a shit person, and that is the working class experience. And so, and nothing in the net zero story actually speaks to that, because the middle class liberals who own the debate have never known that, never experienced that, don't know what that feeling is. Theirs has always been the world to remake. You know, if the world's not quite how I want it, so I'm going to remake it. You know, and that's my right, because I was born into a background where that's what we did. We made the world where we wanted it to be. So, but working class don't have that agency. We've got to find stories about our future that do give space to that agency. I'm trying to articulate something that isn't just a, you know, revolution that isn't going to happen, right? It's not. If there's any revolution, it'll just be people looting the shops and going home with their stuff. So what can we realistically do here? And I think it's how we articulate what we need to do and get beyond this liberal net zero utopia or death, and realise that we're going to have to do some work in the middle. There is our way we do that.
Well, I think that's actually kind of a perfect place to leave it. Chris, thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you.